In history, there are dates that act as a fulcrum, turning the course of events. One of those dates is undoubtedly the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC. On that day, in the Curia of Pompey, a group of senators ended the life of Gaius Julius Caesar, the man who had just won a civil war, conquered Gaul, and been proclaimed dictator for life. His removal did not save the Republic, as the conspirators, clinging to the shadow of a bygone era, naively believed. On the contrary, it plunged the Roman world into 13 years of new, even more bloody civil wars, which finally destroyed the old aristocratic order. We perceive this outcome as a tragic but inevitable culmination of his career. But what if this detail, this one day, had turned out differently? History often depends on trifles. A note not read in time, a warning ignored, or a moment's hesitation. Caesar was not only a general, but also a great reformer. He had begun to rebuild Rome, trying to adapt the institutions of a city-state to the needs of a world empire. But his work was interrupted at the very earliest stage. Let us imagine for a minute that the conspiracy failed. What if Caesar had survived that day and gained another 10 or 20 years of life to complete what he had started? This is a scenario in which Rome does not go through the chaos of the Second Triumvirate, the proscriptions, and the Battle of Actium, but instead follows a firm plan developed by a single genius. It is a world without Octavian Augustus as we know him, and perhaps with a completely different future for all of Western civilization. Watch this video to the end, and you will find out how history could have changed. To understand what Caesar could have changed, one must first realize the state Rome was in by 44 BC. The old republic, designed to govern a single city-state, had been bursting at the seams for 100 years. It could not cope with managing a giant Mediterranean empire. Its institutions were paralyzed by corruption. The senators, whose ancestors had governed the city, now viewed the provinces merely as a source of personal enrichment, feeding troughs for their families, which undermined faith in the government in the provinces. The economy suffered from a monstrous social divide. Giant estates, the latifundia, worked by slaves, were ruining the small farmers who formed the backbone of the army. These ruined peasants flocked to Rome, forming a lumpen proletariat, living off bread and circuses and ready to support anyone who offered them a solution. The army itself became the main problem. The reforms of Gaius Marius had transformed the legions from a citizen militia into a professional army. But now the legionaries were loyal not to the Senate and people of Rome, but to their general, who gave them pay, land, and plunder. This gave rise to the era of strongmen: Marius himself, Sulla, Pompey, and finally Caesar. Civil wars became the norm rather than the exception, the method for resolving political disputes. Gaius Julius Caesar was a product of this system, but he was also the first to try to break it. After conquering Gaul and defeating Pompey in the civil war at Pharsalus, he concentrated all power in his own hands. He was not just a consul, he received the title of dictator for life, dictator perpetuo, an unprecedented and frightening title for the Romans. He began a cascade of reforms. He changed the calendar, which we still use with modifications, initiated debt restructuring, launched massive construction projects, and planned to settle veterans and the urban poor in new colonies, such as Carthage and Corinth. Caesar acted with incredible speed, trying to fix in a few years what had been breaking for centuries. But he made one fundamental mistake. He showed mercy, clementia, to his enemies. He pardoned many of the senators who had fought against him and returned them to the Senate. It was precisely these men, including Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, who formed the core of the conspiracy. They feared not tyranny as such, but that Caesar would take away their sacred right to exclusive rule and enrichment, which the old corrupt system afforded them. Their ideals of liberty were in many ways ideals of preserving their own privileges. We do not know exactly what kind of Rome he wanted to build, but we can speculate on how events might have unfolded if history had taken a different path. Subscribe so you don't miss other alternative versions of history. Let's trace where a different trajectory would have led. On the morning of March 15, 44 BC, the atmosphere in Rome was tense. Caesar was preparing for the greatest campaign of his life, an invasion of Parthia, to avenge the death of Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae. 16 legions were already concentrated in the east. The Senate meeting that day was routine, but it was there that the conspirators planned to strike. In our history, several factors coincided. Caesar's wife Calpurnia begged him not to go, citing a terrible dream. The soothsayer Spurina had warned him of the danger. The Greek teacher Artemidorus even handed him a note with the conspirators' names. Caesar ignored all of it. But now let's suppose a single change occurs. Artemidorus, seeing the dictator put the note aside, shows greater insistence. He grabs Caesar by the arm at the entrance to the Curia of Pompey and demands he read the scroll immediately, saying it concerns his very life. Caesar stops. He scans the list of names: Brutus, Cassius, Casca. These are not just enemies. These are men from his inner circle, men he had showered with honors and offices. A second's hesitation is enough. His loyal ally, Mark Antony, whom the conspirators had prudently distracted, sees the alarm on the dictator's face and rushes to his side. At that moment, the conspiracy collapses. It was designed for surprise and for Caesar entering the hall alone. The warned dictator turns around and, accompanied by Antony, leaves the Senate. His personal guard is summoned immediately. Within hours, Marcus Junius Brutus, Gaius Cassius, and several dozen other senators are arrested. The plan that was meant to save the Republic had failed before it even began. Caesar is alive, but the world will never be the same. This day would be a terrible lesson for him. His famous policy of clementia had utterly failed. The men to whom he had given their lives and careers had answered him with betrayal. Caesar would be forced to admit that the old aristocracy, which he had tried to integrate, would never accept his rule, and that compromise was impossible. He would understand that they saw him not as a savior, but as an obstacle. His future actions would be dictated not by magnanimity, but by cold political necessity. The consequences of the failed conspiracy would have been swift and systemic. Caesar was not Sulla. He would not have organized proscriptions and street massacres. Instead, he would have used the law. The arrested conspirators would have faced trial on charges of insulting the majesty of the Roman people, maestas, and high treason. Given that Caesar controlled the courts and public opinion, which adored him, the verdict would have been a foregone conclusion. The optimates, the aristocratic faction of the Senate, would have been decapitated in one fell swoop, their leaders executed or, at best, sent into permanent exile. Having purged the Senate of open opposition, Caesar would have immediately accelerated what he was already planning, the Parthian campaign. This campaign now served not only foreign policy goals but also domestic ones. First, it allowed him to physically remove the army and its ambitious commanders, like Antony or Lepidus, from Rome, preventing them from concentrating too much power in their own hands. Second, a war against a common enemy, avenging the shame of Crassus and recovering the lost eagle standards, would unite Roman society around the dictator. Unlike Crassus, who had recklessly led his legions deep into the desert, Caesar was a master of logistics and engineering. His plan, as far as we can tell, was not a frontal assault through Mesopotamia. He planned to advance through Armenia, a friendly kingdom to the north. This route, though longer, provided access to fodder, water, and allied kingdoms, which was critical for supplying an army of over 100,000 men. It was a strategy of attrition, not a risky gamble. The Parthians, with their heavy cavalry, cataphracts, and horse archers, would have stood no chance against Caesar's Gaul-hardened legions, supported by his own Gallic and Germanic cavalry. Caesar knew how to fight mounted armies and how to build fortifications. The campaign would likely have taken 2 or 3 years, but its outcome would have been preordained. Parthia would be crushed, its capital Ctesiphon taken, and Rome's eastern border pushed to the Tigris River. Caesar would have returned to Rome in 41 or 40 BC with a triumph that would have eclipsed even Pompey's and Alexander's. Caesar's status as a living deity, already being cultivated, would have become an indisputable fact. This section is dedicated to the administrative and infrastructural reforms Caesar could have conducted, and is thus delivered in a steady analytical tone. Returning from Parthia as the absolute victor and the richest man in the world, thanks to the captured booty, Caesar would have begun the fundamental restructuring of the state. There was no longer any opposition in the Senate. Now he could act not as a temporary dictator, but as the permanent architect of a new order. His reforms would have been aimed at the centralization of power and the unification of the empire. The first step would have been the codification of Roman law. At the time, Roman law was a chaotic jumble of ancient laws, praetorian edicts, and Senate decrees. Caesar planned to collect all of it into a single, logical, and understandable code of laws, a corpus juris civilis. In our history, this titanic work would only be completed by the Emperor Justinian 6 centuries later. Implementing this project in 40 BC would have given the empire a unified legal foundation 600 years earlier, stabilizing jurisprudence in all provinces and accelerating their integration. The second area would have been infrastructural projects on a colossal scale. We know of his plans to drain the Pontine marshes south of Rome, which would have given the city thousands of acres of new fertile land and solved the problem of malaria. Even more ambitious was the project to build a canal across the Isthmus of Corinth in Greece. This canal, which in reality would not be dug until the 19th century, would have radically changed the trade routes in the Mediterranean, connecting the Ionian and Aegean seas. This project would have shortened the sea route around the Peloponnese by hundreds of miles, turning Rome and Italy into the central hub of all Mediterranean trade, shifting the focus from Alexandria and Rhodes. Finally, Caesar would have completed his administrative reform. He would have ended the corrupt system of tax farming, replacing the publicani with state officials on a fixed salary. He would have massively settled his veterans and the Roman proletariat in new colonies, such as Carthage and Corinth, turning them into centers of Romanization. And most importantly, he would have continued his policy of granting Roman citizenship en masse to provincials, especially in his Gaul and in Spain. This was not just an act of generosity, but a pragmatic step toward creating a unified imperial nation, loyal not to the Senate, but to Rome in the person of its dictator. Let's examine what institutions might have been formed under this new arrangement. Having survived the conspiracy, Caesar would have understood that the old republican forms no longer worked, but he was too smart to declare himself king, Rex, a title hateful to the Romans. In our history, his heir Octavian Augustus invented a brilliant fiction, the Principate. He formally restored the Republic, but concentrated all key powers in his own hands, calling himself merely the first senator, Princeps. This was a compromise born of exhaustion from the civil wars. Caesar, having defeated all enemies and a living god in the eyes of the army and the people, would not have needed such a masquerade. He would likely have created a more overt, centralized system, more akin to the Hellenistic monarchies of the East. He wouldn't have needed to pretend to be first among equals. He would have been dominus, master, perhaps not in title, but in substance, relying on the direct support of the legions and the plebs. He might have kept the Senate as a consultative body for the aristocracy, but his real power would have rested on the army and a bureaucratic apparatus personally loyal to him. This apparatus would have been recruited not from senators, but from talented men of lower rank, the equestrians, and even his loyal freedmen. Instead of the title Princeps, he might have made his military title Imperator permanent, which under him first acquired a permanent meaning rather than a temporary one for a victorious general. This would not have been the restored Republic of Augustus, but an open military and administrative monarchy. The Roman world would have been unified much more quickly and rigidly. The cult of personality around Caesar himself, which had already begun during his lifetime, statues, temples, the month of July, would have become the official state ideology, binding the army, the provinces, and the plebs. In cultural terms, this would have meant the continuation of Rome's Hellenization. Caesar was an admirer of Greek culture. He would have actively recruited Greek scholars, architects, and philosophers, especially from Alexandria, with which he had close ties through Cleopatra. Rome would have been transformed into a hybrid Greco-Roman metropolis, a capital where Roman engineering combined with Hellenistic philosophy. The key problem for any monarchy, which Caesar was effectively building, is the transfer of power. In our history, his death created a vacuum that was filled by Mark Antony and Caesar's young, unknown adopted son, Gaius Octavius, later Octavian. Octavian had to fight for 13 years for his inheritance, displaying inhuman cruelty and political acumen to eventually become Augustus. But what if he had had a living adoptive father? Caesar, having survived in 44 BC, would have had years to prepare a successor. His official heir by will was Octavian. Caesar, upon returning from Parthia, would most likely have brought the young man close to him. He would have made him his co-ruler, guided him through all the state offices, and given him command of legions. Octavian was not a military genius like Caesar, but he was an administrative genius. Caesar could have used his talents to implement domestic reforms while he himself handled military affairs. However, there was another more complicated figure, Caesarion, his only biological son from Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. In our history, Octavian ordered Caesarion to be eliminated, seeing him as a direct rival. But a living Caesar would have faced a difficult choice. This choice would determine whether Rome remained a Mediterranean Italic power or transformed into a transcontinental Hellenistic monarchy in the mold of Alexander. On one hand, there was Octavian, a Roman, the ideal heir to govern Rome. On the other, Caesarion, a symbol of the fusion of Rome and the Hellenistic East, the key to the boundless wealth of Egypt. The most likely scenario, Caesar would have formally adopted Caesarion as well, recognizing him, but he would have divided the empire. Octavian would have been prepared as his heir in Rome and the West. Caesarion, under Cleopatra's regency, would have been confirmed as king of Egypt, but as a vassal or junior partner of Rome. In this way, Egypt would have been integrated into the Roman world not through war, as Octavian did after the Battle of Actium, but through a dynastic union. This would have meant Egypt joining Rome not as a conquered province, but as a formally equal kingdom. The wealth of the Nile would have flowed to Rome without bloodshed, financing reforms in the army. Let's compare the known outcome with the possible alternative. In our history, Caesar's death in 44 BC led to chaos. 13 years of civil wars, the war against Brutus and Cassius, the war with Sextus Pompey, the war between Octavian and Antony, exhausted the treasury, destroyed an entire generation of the aristocracy, and led to massive land confiscations in Italy, which created social tension for decades. Octavian Augustus inherited a ruined world and was forced to spend the 40 years of his reign healing it, creating the compromise system of the Principate, and restoring the economy. In our alternative scenario, these 13 years of war simply do not exist. Rome does not lose time and resources. The Roman peace, Pax Romana, which in our history began with Augustus around 27 BC, would have begun 15-20 years earlier, immediately after Caesar's return from the Parthian campaign. And it would have begun not in a state of exhaustion, but in a state of triumph. The treasury would be full of Parthian gold. The army would be busy on the frontiers, not in Italy. The system of government would have been different. Instead of the Principate of Augustus, a disguised monarchy that pretended the Senate still mattered, we would have gotten a more overt, centralized, and efficient empire of Caesar. It would have been a system more akin to the later Dominate of Diocletian, but established 300 years earlier. By establishing a clear, centralized, and deified authority immediately, Caesar might have prevented many of the future succession crises that plagued the compromise Principate. This could have made the empire more stable in the long run, as the crisis of the 3rd century, largely caused by the fiction of the emperor's power and the army's struggles for their own candidates, might not have happened. Thus, one single scroll, read on March 15, 44 BC, would not just have saved one man's life. It would have saved Rome from an entire generation of civil war. It would have accelerated the establishment of the empire, changed its political structure from soft to hard, and allowed Rome to enter its golden age with full resources, not wasted on internal conflicts. The history we have explored is not just a fantasy. It is an attempt to understand what exactly was lost on the Ides of March. Caesar's death cut short the most ambitious reform project in Roman history. Instead of a rapid and decisive restructuring of the state, carried out by a military genius, Rome got 13 years of chaos and a compromise system created by a political genius, Octavian Augustus. Augustus healed wounds that Caesar perhaps could have prevented. We live in a world that Augustus built. Caesar's survival would have meant a different path. It would have been a path of faster centralization, deeper Hellenization, and, possibly, a different geography. A successful Parthian campaign could have permanently changed the balance of power in the East, and the integration of Egypt through dynasty, not war, would have created a very different empire. This is a reminder that history is not just the result of impersonal economic processes, but also a chain of decisions, accidents, and the lives of single individuals who stood at the helm. Subscribe so you don't miss new versions of history